My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. I used to believe life was supposed to have some balance, that love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. For years, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. I cooked, cleaned, worked part-time at the library, and raised our 2 kids with a patience I didn't know I had. My ex-husband, Bennett, had a way of making me believe I owed him everything. My time, my money, my body, my voice. I clung to the scraps of affection he tossed my way like they were treasures, convincing myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, he would finally see me. I was wrong. The day he left, he didn't just take the kids. He emptied out our savings account and left me with less than $100 to my name. I remember the moment vividly, because betrayal always leaves a scar where it cuts. I walked into the bank, my hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for groceries, the usual weekly ritual. The teller looked at me with pity, her eyes flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out that morning. Every penny gone. My chest collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it. My hands shook when I called Bennett, but his number had already been blocked. I checked the kids' school, but the office told me he had picked them up early that day. I stood outside in the hot sunlight, feeling it burn against my skin, realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. My family was gone. My savings were gone. And so was every ounce of trust one had in him. The house felt like a tomb that night. Their toys scattered across the living room looked like abandoned evidence of a crime scene. The silence was louder than any scream. I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest, rocking back and forth until my tears blurred the room into a watercolor of grief. The neighbors whispered, I could feel their judgment in the air. People always think they know the truth about a marriage until it collapses. My mother called me naive. My sister said, I warned you. None of their words mattered. The truth was simple. I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. The days blurred into each other after that, a fog of shock and disbelief. I filed reports, called lawyers, and begged anyone who would listen. The law moved slowly, like it always does when women are crying but no one sees bruises. He's their father, they said, as though that excused the theft of both children and savings. My lawyer shook his head sympathetically, muttering words about custody hearings, financial disputes. A process. But while the process crawled forward like a wounded animal, I was left behind in the ashes, trying to breathe through the smoke of my own ruined life. Nights were the worst because nights carried memories. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past year. The fights over money. The secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. The smell of perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. All the little warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in us. Now, with every sound of the empty house echoing around me, I could see it clearly. He had been planning this for months. The account transfers. The sudden interest in the kids' routines. The long absences with weak excuses. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had executed a plan to erase me. And yet, some twisted part of me still loved him, or at least loved the version of him I thought was real. That was the cruelest truth of all. On the 5th day, when I thought I couldn't fall any lower, the call came. I almost didn't answer, because the number was unfamiliar. But something in me, it could have been fate or just morbid curiosity, made me press the green button. His voice hit me like a hammer, raw and desperate, so different from the coldness that had cut me off. Selene, he rasped, like speaking my name hurt him. I need you. For a moment I froze, my heart clashing between hatred and the dangerous pull of old love. Then his words spilled out in a rush. There was a trial, charges against him, and without me testifying, he was going to lose everything. I almost laughed. After taking my children, my savings, and my sanity, now he wanted me to save him. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream. But instead, I stayed silent, listening to his frantic breath on the other end. The irony was too sharp to ignore. 5 days ago, he had left me with nothing, not even dignity. Now he was crawling back, begging for the one thing only I could give. my testimony. My words could either save him or bury him. The weight of that truth pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Somewhere deep inside, a new version of me stirred awake, one who wasn't afraid anymore, one who had been burned too badly to ever be gentle again. As his pleas filled my ear, I walked across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children, their innocent smiles frozen in time. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. He thought I was still the same Selene who would sacrifice everything for his comfort, the woman who would bend until she broke. He thought wrong. I whispered into the phone, low and steady. "Bennett, you're going to regret ever underestimating me." His silence on the other end told me he heard the truth in my voice. That silence was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. But as I ended the call, my heart thundered with the realization that this was only the beginning. His downfall wouldn't come easy. He would fight, manipulate, twist the truth, and even try to use the kids as pawns. This wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a war for survival. And I was done being the one who lost. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. It felt dangerous. When I first met Bennett, he wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. He was charming in a way that disarmed me instantly. Broad-shouldered, deep laugh, the kind of man who seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel seen. I was 24, working at a small bookstore, paying off student loans, and convinced that romance belonged in novels more than real life. But Bennett swept me up in a whirlwind of promises. Late-night drives, flowers left on my doorstep, long conversations about dreams and futures. He told me he wanted a family, stability, love that lasted. And I believed him. Back then, every smile felt like destiny, every kiss a contract. My friends called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. I never imagined that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. Like fine lines. I used to believe life was supposed to have some balance. It was his jokes, love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. About how I spent too much time with my books, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. Then it was his disapproval of my part-time at the library, subtle comments about how certain kids with a patience I didn't know I had. The wrong attention. My ex-husband, at the time, I brushed it off as care, believe I owed him everything. He wanted me all, my money, my body, my voice. That's love, isn't it? I clung to the scraps of affection. He tossed my way like they were treasures. Love doesn't make you apologize for existing if I gave enough skin. He would finally see me. I told myself he was just protective. The day he left, wanted the best. He didn't just take the kids. Denial is a dangerous drug. He emptied out our savings account and left me with less than $100 to my name. Harder to ignore. I remember the moment vividly. He insisted I quit my full-time job, leaves a saying it was pointless. Since his salary could cover the bills. My hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for time at the library was the usual weekly ritual. The teller looked at me with anything more. Her eyes flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out that morning. I smiled and agreed. My chest collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it. But inside, my hands shook when I called Bennett. But his ambitions had already shelved like dusty books no one checked out anymore. But the office told me and every time I tried to take one back, I stood outside in the hot sunlight. Our family feeling it burn against my skin. The family always came realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. My family was gone, and with my savings were gone. I didn't see and closing. So was every ounce of trust. When our first child, Emery, was born, the house felt like a tomb. Every parenting decision into a test scattered across the living room. If I disagreed, like abandoned evidence he accused me of not trusting him. The silence was louder than any scream. He dismissed I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest. I wanted to believe we were back and forth until my tears blurred his voice was always watercolor of grief. His word the neighbors whispered. By the time our second child, Rowan, arrived, people always think they know the truth about a marriage until it collapses. Friends drifted away. Called me naive, tired of my constant cancellations and excuses. I warned you. My family their words mattered. Weary of the tension whenever Bennett was around. I had given my life to a man who my world became to destroy me. Confined to the house, blurred into each other after that. Rules. A fog of shock became another leash around my neck. I filed reports, called lawyers, and begged anyone who would listen. He started moving things. The law moved slowly, like it always does. He gave me an allowance for groceries, gas, and whatever else you need. As if I were a teenager asking my father for pocket money. As though that excused the theft whenever I questioned in savings. He'd smile and say, my lawyer shook his head sympathetically. You don't understand finances, muttering words about custody hearings, financial disputes, and because I wanted peace more than conflict, but while the process crawled forward like a wounded animal over time, I was left behind in the ashes. Never did. Trying to golf trips with friends of my own ruined life. Expensive dinners with clients were the worst because nights carried memories. And I was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, makes you mute, replaying every moment of the past year. The first time I truly suspected betrayal, the fights over money, it wasn't perfume or secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. The smell started disappearing his shirt that wasn't claiming mine. Meetings all ran the little late, warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in us. He'd come home with that edge in his every voice, sound of the empty sharp house enough to warn me not to ask questions. I could see it clearly, and when I did, he had been back on this for months, accusing me of being paranoid, insecure, the sudden interest in the kids' routine. I found a receipt for a dinner at a restaurant we had never been to together. When I asked about it, he laughed, kissed my forehead and said, a plan to erase me, baby. And yet, some twisted part of me still loved him. His gaslighting was polished, or at least loved the version of him I thought was real. I doubted my own instincts. That was the cruelest truth of all. Deep down, my stomach churned with when I thought I wasn't ready to any lower. The call came. What hurt most wasn't just his didn't answer. It was the way he weaponized love. But something in me, it could have been coldness or just morbid curiosity, freezing me out for days, only to thaw with sudden tenderness. His voice hit me like a hammer, of roses, raw and a spontaneous trip to the lake, from the coldness that had cut me off. In bed. Celine, those moments made me think I was crazy, my name maybe I was imagining the cruelty. But manipulation is clever. My heart always gives you just enough hope to keep the dangerous pull of old love. I clung to those flashes of the man I married in a rush, praying he'd come back for good. There was a trial, charges against him. Instead, he was fading away, replaced by someone harder, greedier, I almost laughed. Looking back, taking my children, my savings, and my sanity, escape for years. Now he wanted me to save accounts. I wanted to hang up. He used on everyone else, so no one would believe me if I cried. I stayed silent. The way he kept me financially and emotionally dependent. The irony was too sharp to ignore. He built the perfect stage for his vanishing act. He had left me with nothing, too blinded by loyalty to see it. Now he was crawling back, every dismissal, begging for the one thing only I could give. It was all scaffolding for the moment my words could either save him or bury him. The day he took the kids, and the weight of that truth impressed down on me until I could hardly finale of a performance somewhere I hadn't realized I was part of. A new version of me stirred awake. And that realization one who wasn't afraid than any heartbreak. One who had been tell myself too now that I was a victim gentle again. But I don't want to stay one. Filled my memory has a way of twisting, across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children. Every flashback, every warning sign I frozen in time, is now ammunition. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. He could strip me of everything. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. But he forgot something important. He thought I was still him better than anyone who would sacrifice everything for his comfort. His tells, his the woman who would bend until she broke. And as I sit here remembering the woman I was, I whispered into the phone, I feel the sharp edge of the woman I am becoming. You're going to regret cracks in our marriage may have broken me once. But his silence on the other end told me he heard the truth in my voice. The courthouse smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, than any revenge I had ever dreamed of and routine. But as I ended the call, there with my hands clasped so tightly with the realization that this was only the beginning. At the polished wooden doors where Bennett would come through at any moment. He would fight, my attorney whispered strategies in my ear, and even try to use the custody percentages, financial disclosures, this wasn't just a battle for justice schedules. It was a war for survival, like static, and I was done being the one wasn't on paper. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel Emery broken. And Rowan weren't dangerous points or percentages. When I first met Bennett, they were flesh and blood. He wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. Yet here I was. He was charming in a way that disarmed me to be their mother. While Bennett strutted around like the star of his own performance, the kind of man who seemed to know exactly when the doors finally opened, and he stepped in with that smug, working at a small bookstore, paying off student loans. I felt a tremor in my chest, and convinced that he wasn't just here to fight for more than real life. He was here to destroy me up in a whirlwind. He played the role of doting late-night drives, flowers left on my doorstep, about his children, long conversations about dreams and futures. His voice soft and reverent. He told me he wanted a family, bedtime stories, soccer practices, piano recitals. And I believed him. Back then, every smile felt like for every scrape, every kiss, and every late-night fever. My friends called us as if he hadn't left me alone to manage it all. My jaw clenched as I listened, the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe, even unfit. He smiled at me across the room as if daring me to contradict him, as if he knew no one would believe me. And when his attorney called me financially dependent, I saw the trap he had set years ago snapping shut. The allowance, the hidden accounts, the forced resignations, they weren't just about control. They were evidence he could now use against me. I wanted to scream, to stand up and tell the judge that the man they saw was a mask, that beneath it lived a liar who had abandoned his wife, who had stripped me of my savings, who had already broken his vows long before the paperwork was filed. But the courtroom wasn't a place for emotion. It was a battlefield where facts were weapons. And Bennett had polished his until they gleamed. Mine were buried beneath years of silence, fear, and compromise. I sat frozen, torn between wanting to fight and wanting to collapse, knowing every tremor in my voice would be twisted into proof that I was unstable. He didn't need to shout to win. He just had to watch me unravel. My name is Selene Whitford, when the hallways thinned and the lawyers scattered. I used to believe life was supposed to have some balance. That love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. The same cologne for years, he always wore, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. You can't win this, Selene. I cooked, cleaned, worked part-time at the library. His smile soft enough to fool our two kids with a patience I didn't know I had. The kids are better off with me. My ex-husband, Bennett, had a way of making me believe I owed him everything. I wanted to shove my money, my body, to claw at the mask he wore. I clung to the scraps of affection he tossed my way like they were treasures, into the eyes of the man I had once that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, he didn't even look angry. See me, just amused. Confident the day he left, his performance he didn't just take the kids, and in that moment he emptied out our savings account and left me with less than $100 to my name. It was I remember the moment vividly, and arrogance because betrayal always leaves a scar. The weeks dragged on. Each court date a dagger. My hands sweaty as I when she realized she wouldn't always come home to me. The usual weekly ritual grew quieter. The teller looked at me into himself, her eyes flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out. I hated what this fight was doing to them. Every penny gone. Hated that their innocence collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it. At night, when the house was too quiet, when I called Bennett, I would curl up in their beds, but his number had already been blocked. Tracing the outlines of their toys, but the office told me he had picked them up early that I'd never stop fighting. I stood outside in the hot sunlight, fear gnawed at me, feeling it burn against my skin. What if the judge believed Bennett? Realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. The thought hollowed me out. My family was gone, leaving me cold and shaking. My savings were gone. I started documenting everything. Every ounce of every text he sent him, every missed hiccup. The house felt like every time the kids mentioned a broken promise. Their toys scattered across the living room. It felt like abandoned evidence, like I was some desperate detective clinging to scraps. The silence was louder than any scream. As the pages filled, I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest, proof, rocking back and forth until my tears had used to trap me financially of grief. I would now use to expose him emotionally. I could feel their judgment. He wanted to play chess with my children. Always think they know the truth, but I was no longer just a bystander. I was learning the game, me naive, and if I had to bleed on the board to protect them, I warned you. Friends who had once vanished began to reappear. The truth was simple. Reaching out quietly, I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. A former neighbor told me she had seen Bennett into another after that. Tall, a fog of shock, always slipping into his car late at night. I filed reports. Another friend shared stories of his arrogance who would company events. The law bragging about managing like it always does when women are crying, but no one sees was a shard of glass. Cutting me, but also arming me. As I began to see that Bennett wasn't in savings. My lawyer shook his head in his pride, muttering words about he could script every outcome had left trails behind him. A process, and I was finally brave enough to follow forward like a wounded animal. But with every small victory came behind in the ashes. One afternoon, when I picked the kids up from his ruined life, Emery refused to hug me because she looked at me with eyes too old for her years. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, my heart cracked every moment from the past year. But from the fact that she believed him, the secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. I'll always take care of you, baby. The smell of perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. He wasn't just fighting warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to rewriting their memories, poisoning their every sound of the empty house echoing around me. I could see that was a battle no courtroom could fix. He had been planning this for months. Still, I refused to let him transfers. Late at night, after the kids fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my notes, weak excuses, my receipts, my quiet fury. He hadn't just I thought about every humiliation. He had every moment he made me to erase me. Every dollar he took, some twisted part of me shared with someone else while I waited at home. Or at least loved the version of him I thought was real, incapable. That was the cruelest truth of all. But he didn't understand that pain has a way of transforming into steel if you let it. The call came. tired of being his victim. I almost didn't answer. If he wanted a war, the number was unfamiliar. Only something in me, I wouldn't fight on his terms, or just morbid curiosity. The day I realized I wasn't just defending myself, but planning something bigger. His voice hit me like a hammer, raw and I was flipping through my notes when I saw a pattern that he hadn't noticed. Selene, a business trip that overlapped with one of the mysterious dinners. I need you. A credit card charge that contradicted his alibi. My heart clashing between hatred and the dangerous pull of old love. But enough to wedge a crowbar into. Then his words spilled out in a rush. For the first time in years, there was a trial of charges against him, and without me testifying, he was going to lose his kingdom on lies. I almost laughed. And I was finally holding my children, my savings, and my sanity. The only question was how far I was willing to go. I wanted to hang up. I used to think revenge was loud. I wanted to scream, a slammed door, a screaming match, silent, a dramatic listening to his frantic breath. But I learned quickly that real revenge is quiet. The irony was too sharp to ignore. It's in the details. 5 days ago, he had your enemy doesn't bother to look, not even because he assumes you're too broken to stand. Now he was crawling back, Bennett underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. My testimony. I started small. My words could either save him or bury him there. The weight of that truth pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Bennett had somewhere deep inside after Emery was born. A new version of me stirred awake. A neighbor agreed to testify that he was rarely home during the years he claimed he was too badly to ever be gentle again. The documents were fragile, like pleas filled my ear. But I was weaving them together into a net, stared at the framed picture of our children as I laid out my growing smiles frozen in time. I felt myself transforming. My hands trembled, I wasn't just defending custody anymore. For the first time in years, I felt to dismantle the man who had dismantled me. He thought I was still the same Selene who would sacrifice everything for his comfort. Too good at twisting words. The woman who would bend until she broke. At putting on the performance of a devoted father. I whispered into the phone, I needed something undeniable. Bennett, something that would strip his mask in front of everyone he had fooled. His silence on the other end, the blonde who had slipped into his car at night, was that silence was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. Who she was, what she meant. My heart thundered with the realization that this was only the beginning. If Bennett had flaunted his hypocrisy so carelessly, I could use it. Fight, manipulate, I found her one evening by following the breadcrumb trail of his credit card statements. This wasn't just a battle for justice. Restaurant downtown. It was a war for survival with late-night charges. And I was done being the one who lost. Even a hotel receipt with his name on it. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel every discovery. Felt dangerous. But beneath the pain was something hotter. When I first met Bennett, clarity. He wasn't the man who would later tear my world fingerprints everywhere. He was charming in a way that disarmed the man who called me unfit, broad-shouldered, was leading a double life. The kind of man who decided to confront what to say to make me feel seen. My hands shook so hard I was 24, working at a small bookstore. Her name was Annalise, paying off student loans. She was younger and convinced that romance belonged in novels always gravitated toward. But Bennett swept me up in a whirlwind of promises. I met her at the cafe where she worked flowers left on my doorstep. And for a moment, long conversations about dreams and futures. She wasn't cruel-looking. He told me he wanted a family. She was just another woman caught in his web. And someone who probably believed the lies he told her. Every smile felt like destiny. Introduced myself as Selene. My friends called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. The coffee cup she held trembled that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe. And in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret. That regret became an opening, and I knew then I wasn't alone in this fight. Annalise gave me more than I hoped for. She had texts, photos, even voice messages where Bennett complained about me, mocked me, strategized about custody like it was a business deal. She had been his confidant, and now, in her guilt, she handed me his secrets like weapons. My hands shook as I scrolled through his words, each one a nail in the coffin of his performance. She'll fold. He had written about me. She always does. My stomach turned, but I kept scrolling. He had underestimated me not just in court but in life. He believed his version of me, the woman he had controlled, silenced, and discarded, was the only one that existed. He had no idea who I was becoming. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. I felt a shift in the air. I used to believe life was supposed to have some balance. My attorney laid out the hotel receipts, that love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. For years, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. A crack in the armor that made my pulse race, worked part-time at the library, leaned forward, and raised our two kids scratching against I didn't know I had. As the reality of my ex-husband unfolded, had a way of making me believe I had been the one cornered, my time, my money, my body, my voice. Now it was his turn. I clung to the scraps of affection he tossed my way like they were treasures, convincing myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I was wrong. I felt something the day he left. He didn't just take the kids. And Bennett he emptied out our savings account and left me with less than $100 harder into the role of victim. I remember the moment vividly. He claimed I was betrayal always leaves a scar, that I was poisoning the children against him. I walked into the bank, my hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for groceries, driven not by love for my kids but by revenge. The teller looked at me with stung because they were half true. Her eyes flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out at the expense of my children. Every penny was for them. My chest collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it, not people. My hands shook when I called Bennett. I could see the seeds of doubt, but his number had already been blocked. I checked Bennett the kids' was slippery, but the office told me every gain I made felt like it teetered on the edge of collapse. I stood outside in the hot sunlight. The kids felt the tension feeling it burn against my skin, clingier, realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. While Rowan started biting his nails until my savings were gone. I wanted to shield them from it all. Every ounce of trust one had already spilled into their world. The house felt like a tomb that night. I held them tighter, their toys scattered across the living room looked like that I would never give up of a crime scene. But inside I was terrified. The silence was louder than any scream. What if Bennett found a way to twist I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears. What if my children grew up believing his version of me until my tears blurred the knife I carried daily, sharp and heavy. The neighbors whispered I could feel their judgment in the ally. People always think they know the truth about a marriage until it collapses. But she seemed determined to make it right. Naive. She testified willingly. Her voice shaking but none of their words recounted Bennett's manipulation. The truth was simple. Watching him squirm, I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. This was the man who once towered over me. The days blurred into each other after that. Who had made me feel small with a single shock and disbelief. Now he was shrinking before my eyes. Called lawyers, but I didn't beg anyone who would listen. I knew the war wasn't over, like it always does when women only made him more dangerous, more desperate. And desperate men are unpredictable, as though that excused the theft of both children waiting for his next move. My lawyer shook his head of the phone made my chest muttering words about every shadow outside the house felt like a threat. I wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. While the process crawled forward like a wounded survival. I was left behind in the ashes, waiting for me to breathe through the smoke of my own ruined life. Not this time. Nights were the worst, because now I had something I hadn't had in years. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself ready to strike harder. The day ended with a moment I'll never forget. The fights over money. After a particularly brutal phone calls, I pretended not to notice. I walked out into the cold air. The smell of my perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. Emery ran into my arms. All the little warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in Rowan's small hand slipped into every sound of the empty house echoing around me. Innocent, I could see it fragile, clearly, trusting. He had been planning this for months. That was my why. Transfers. Bennett thought this was about winning in the kids' routines. For me, it was about survival, the long absences with weak excuses. And as I stood there holding the two pieces of my heart, I made a silent vow. Executed a plan to erase me. Not by a long shot. Some twisted part of me had just begun, and this time I was ready to play by my own rules. That was the cruelest truth of all. Disappear. On the fifth day, when I thought I couldn't fall any lower, the call that the moment my evidence landed in front of the judge, because the number was unfamiliar. He didn't. But something in me, it came back swinging, or just morbid curiosity. Rumors started made me press the green button. Parents at Emery's school his voice hit me like a hammer, raw and desperate. That I was poisoning my kids from the coldness that had cut me off. I saw the way teachers looked at me differently, like speaking my name. How invitations to birthday parties stopped coming. For a moment, at first, I couldn't figure out how the lines had traveled so fast and the dangerous pull then I realized. Then his words spilled out in a rush. There was a trial. He smiled his way into sympathy, and without me testifying, he was going to lose everything I once trusted. I almost laughed. It wasn't just about winning after taking my children, anymore. My savings, and my sanity. He was dismantling now me in the court of public opinion. I wanted to hang up. The walls of my world I wanted to scream. But instead, I stayed silent. It was the official frantic breath on the other morning. A crisp envelope arrived from Child Protective Services. 5 days ago, my hands trembled as I read the words. Not even dignity. A report had been filed alleging neglect, begging for the one thing only I could give. I knew it was testimony. My words would claim I save him or bury him. That I fed them the weight of that truth pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Somewhere deep inside, but the words were written on government stirred awake, which meant I had to prove myself innocent. One who had been burned too badly. A stranger was going to walk into my home as his judge my children's safety. I walked across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children. Wasn't just fighting me in court. Their innocent smiles frozen in time. He was trying to erase me from my children's lives, but not from fear this time. The visit came for the first time in years. I felt a woman named Miss Pratt walked through my front door. He thought I was still the same Selene who would sacrifice everything like she was cataloging the woman who would bend until she broke. I had scrubbed the house until my fingers blistered. I whispered into the phone, low so the air smelled like comfort. Bennett, you're going to regret Emery and Rowan's artwork on the fridge, as if love could be displayed like trophies. His silence on the other end told me he heard the truth in my voice. Confused by the stranger's questions. That silence was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. Does mommy feed you? But as I ended Rowan's the call, lip quivered as he whispered. Thundered with the realization that this was only faces. His downfall wouldn't come easy. Declaring he would fight, manipulate, twist the truth, and even try to use the kids as pride and terror. This wasn't just a battle for justice. My life hung in Ms. Pratt's clipboard. It was a war for survival, and I hated Bennett more than I ever thought possible. When she finally left, I didn't feel broken. Relief washed over me, but it was hollow. When I first met Bennett, I knew this wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. He was willing to destroy me by any means necessary. Broad-shouldered, deep laugh. The kind of man who using the very children to say to make to love as weapons. I was 24, Emery working at a small bookstore, fear, paying off student loans. Every time they asked why Daddy was saying mean things about me, belonged in novels more than real life. Innocence cracked. But Bennett swept me up in a whirlwind of promises, to confront him in the street, late night to drag his flowers left on my doorstep. But I couldn't. Conversations about dreams on my explosions. He told me he wanted a family, I'd give him exactly what he wanted. Lasted. Proof of the unfit mother he painted me to be. Every smile felt like adjusted my strategy. Every kiss a contract. I became quieter. My friends called us perfect. Instead of confronting his lies, I never imagined that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe. I had neighbors write statements about the nights he never came home. I didn't shout back when people whispered at the grocery store. I smiled even when my stomach churned, because I knew appearances were currency in this war. Bennett wanted me rattled, unstable. Instead, I became a mirror, reflecting his cruelty with calm precision. I learned quickly that the most dangerous weapon wasn't anger. It was composure. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. Every night I double-checked the locks. Life was supposed to have some balance. Every time the phone rang, that love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. Bennett had turned life into a chessboard of the perfect wife and I couldn't afford a single misstep. I cooked, cleaned, yet there were part-time at the library, small, fragile and raised our two kids with a patience I didn't know I had. Emery's laughter when she painted my nails with glitter had a way of making me believe I owed him everything, asking me to tuck him in. My money, my body, my voice. These slivers of love became scraps of affection. He tossed my way like they were treasures. Convincing myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, he wasn't just he would finally see me. He was trying to teach my children that their mother was disposable. He didn't just take the kids, and I would never let him win that lesson. He emptied out our savings account. The court dates dragged on, $100 each one a fresh battlefield. I remember the moment Bennett's attorney smeared me with cold precision, always leaves turning every moment of my past into a weapon. I walked into the bank. My hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for groceries. The usual weekly therapy during her postpartum years. The teller looked at me with pity. Unfit. Her eyes flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out that morning. But some days I felt like we were bailing water from a sinking ship. My chest collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it. Just when the pressure seemed unbearable, my hands shook when I called Bennett. Resurfaced, but his number had already been blocked. With even more. I checked the kids' screenshots of conversations where Bennett bragged about filing false reports. I stood outside in the hot sunlight, making Selene jump burn against my skin. The words were realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. The mask was slipping. My family was gone. Still, Bennett's savings were gone. If anything, so was the evidence made him more venomous in him. The house felt like showing up at drop-offs with that smug smile, scattered across the living room, looked like abandoned evidence of a crime scene. The silence was louder than any so close I could smell his cologne. I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest. Rocking back and forth until my tears blurred the room into a watercolor of grief. Because I knew something he didn't. I could feel their judgment in the air. Every smirk. People always think they know the truth about a marriage until it collapses. I wasn't just surviving his storm. My mother called me naive. I was building one of my own. My sister said. And then one night I received a call that shifted everything. The Annalise's voice shook through the phone. I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. I have something blurred into each other something after that could end this. A fog of shock my heart raced as she explained. I filed reports, her words like fire, igniting anyone who would listen. I didn't know yet what the evidence was, like it always does,
only that
when
it was
women are
damning
crying,
enough
but
to
no
scare
one
even
sees
her.
bruises. For the first time, I
He's
felt the
their
scales
father,
begin
they
to
said.
tip, as though
Bennett
that thought he had me
excused the theft
cornered,
of both
but
children
he didn't
and savings.
realize the trap
My
I was
lawyer
about to
shook
set.
his head
As I hung up the phone,
muttering
I stared
words
out the
about
window at the
custody
dark
hearings,
street, financial
the weight of
disputes,
everything pressing
a
down on me.
process.
This
But while the
wasn't
process
over.
crawled forward
It was
like a
only
wounded
beginning.
animal, I was left behind
He thought
in the
he was
ashes,
untouchable,
trying to breathe
but the
through the
walls he
smoke
built
of my
around
own
his
lies
life
were beginning to crack.
Nights were the worst,
And when they
because
finally
nights
collapsed,
carried
I
memories.
promised myself
It
I
was
would
in
be
one
there,
of those dark,
not just to
sleepless
watch,
nights
that
but
I
to
found
make sure he
myself
fell with
staring at the
nothing
ceiling,
left to stand on.
replaying every
The next
moment
morning,
of the past
I sat
year.
at my kitchen
The
table,
fights over money,
coffee untouched,
the secret phone
waiting
calls
for
I
Annalise.
pretended not to notice.
The house was still,
the smell
Emery
of
and
perfume
Rowan
on
off
his
his
shirt
school.
that wasn't
The
mine.
silence heavy like
all
the
the little
moment
warning
before thunder
signs I had
splits the
ignored
sky.
because I wanted
My
to
hands
believe in
shook
us.
as I tapped the
Now,
rim of the
with
mug,
every sound of the
replaying
empty
her
house
words
from
echoing
last night,
around me.
I have
I could
something
see it
big.
clearly.
She wouldn't
He
say
had been
more
planning
over the
this
phone.
for months.
All I knew
Account
was that she had a
transfers.
file, the sudden
Something
interest
Bennett
in the
never
kids'
intended
routines,
anyone to see.
the long
When
absences
the knock
with
finally
weak
came,
excuses, sharp and deliberate.
he
My
hadn't
heart
just
stuttered.
abandoned me.
I opened the door
He
to
had
find
executed
Annalise
a plan
standing
to
there,
erase me.
her expression
And yet,
hard,
some twisted
clutching
part of
a
me
manila
still loved
folder
him,
thick enough to
or at
carry the
least
weight of
loved
my
the
version
future.
of him I thought
She
was
didn't
real.
waste time with
That was the
pleasantries.
cruelest truth of
She
all.
walked past
On
me,
the fifth
dropped the
day,
folder
when I
onto
thought
the
I
table
couldn't
and
fall
said,
any lower,
"This
the
is
call
it,
came.
Selene."
I
This
almost
is how
didn't
we bring
answer,
him down,
because the number
I
was
stared at the
unfamiliar,
folder like it was
but
a
something
bomb.
in me,
It
my
could have been
hands hovered
fate
above
or
it,
just morbid
afraid
curiosity,
that opening it would
made me
unleash
press the
something
green
I wasn't
button.
ready to face.
His voice hit
Annalise
me like a
pulled out
hammer,
the first
raw
sheet,
and desperate.
a series
So
of bank
different from the
statements.
coldness that had cut
Bennett
me off.
hasn't just been
"Selene,"
lying about you,
he
she
rasped,
said, her
like
voice
speaking
low.
my name hurt him.
He's
"I
been
need
lying
you."
about his
For
own
a moment,
finances.
I froze.
My
My
eyes
heart
scanned the
clashing
numbers,
between hatred and the
disbelief
dangerous
tightening
pull
my
of old
chest.
love.
Hidden
Then
accounts,
his words spilled
wire
out in a rush.
transfers.
There was
large
a trial
withdrawals
charges
during the
against
very
him,
weeks he
and
claimed
without
he
me
was
testifying,
broke,
he
begging
was going
the
to
court
lose
for leniency
everything.
on child
I
support.
almost laughed.
After
He had
taking my
funneled
children,
money
my
into a
savings,
separate
and my
account
sanity,
under his brother's name.
Now he wanted me to
Annalise
save him.
leaned closer.
I wanted to hang
her
up,
eyes burning.
I wanted to scream.
This isn't just a
but
custody
instead,
battle
I stayed
anymore.
silent.
This is fraud.
Listening to his frantic
If the court
breath on the
sees
other
this,
end.
he won't
the
just
irony
lose
was
the
too
kids.
sharp to ignore.
He could lose
5
his
days
freedom.
ago, he had
I
left me
swallowed
with nothing,
hard,
not
the
even
reality
dignity,
crashing over
now
me.
he was crawling
It wasn't
back,
just about
begging
protecting
for
my
the one
children
thing
anymore.
only I could give.
It was about
my
exposing the
testimony.
rot Bennett had
My
buried
words could
beneath
either
his
save
polished
him or bury
exterior.
him.
The weight of that truth
he'd worn
pressed
the mask
down
of a
on me
devoted
until
father,
I could hardly breathe.
a successful provider,
Somewhere deep inside,
a victim of my
a
supposed
new version of me
instability.
stirred awake.
But here was
one
proof
who wasn't
he was
afraid
nothing
anymore,
more than a con man,
one who
in
had
a
been
tailored
burned
suit.
too badly
and
to
yet,
ever be
a
gentle
flicker
again.
of doubt gnawed
As
at
his
me.
pleas filled
What
my
if the
ear,
judge doesn't
I walked
care?
across the living
I
room
whispered,
and stared at the
what if
framed
they
picture
think
of
I'm
our
just
children,
desperate,
their
grasping
innocent
for
smiles
straws?
frozen in time.
Annalise shook her
My
head
hands
firmly.
trembled, but
These
not from
aren't
fear
straws,
this time.
Selene.
For the first
These
time
are
in
nails
years,
for
I
his
felt
coffin.
a flicker of power.
Judges care about one thing
He
above
thought I
all
was
else.
still the same Selene who would
Integrity.
sacrifice everything
And this
for
shows
his comfort.
he has none.
The woman who would
As she
bend
laid
until
out
she
more
broke.
documents, he thought
The picture
wrong.
became clearer
I whispered into
and
the phone,
uglier.
low and steady.
Emails where he mocked
Bennett,
the court
you're
system.
going to regret
bragging
ever
to friends
underestimating
that
me.
money talks louder than
His
justice.
silence on the other end
Text
told me
messages
he
to
heard
his
the
mistress
truth in my voice,
gloating about how he was going to
was sweeter
break
than
Selene
any
until
revenge
she
I had
begs.
ever dreamed of.
Every word was a
But
dagger.
as I ended the call,
reopening wounds
my heart
I thought had
thundered with the
scarred over.
realization that
But
this
I
was
forced
only
myself
the
to
beginning.
read them all.
His downfall
to absorb
wouldn't
the
come
full
easy.
scope of his
He
deception.
would fight, manipulate,
because each
twist
piece
the
wasn't
truth,
just
and even
evidence.
try to use the
It
kids
was
as
truth.
pawns.
Proof
This
that I
wasn't
wasn't
just a battle
crazy,
for justice.
that I hadn't imagined
It was
the
a war
cruelty,
for survival.
that the man I once
and I was
loved
done
was
being
as
the one who
venomous as my
lost.
instincts
For
had
the
always
first time in a
screamed.
long time,
When
I didn't
Annalise
feel broken.
finally stopped,
Felt dangerous.
silence filled the
When
room.
I first met
My
Bennett,
pulse thundered
he
in
wasn't
my
the man
ears.
who would later
For a
tear my
moment,
world
I
apart.
couldn't breathe.
It was
He was
overwhelming
charming
in a way that disarmed
relief
me
and
instantly.
rage tangled into one.
Broad-shouldered, deep
So
laugh.
what now?
The kind of man
I
who
asked,
seemed
my
to know
voice
exactly
barely
what to say
audible.
to make me feel
Annalise
seen.
leaned back.
I was 24,
folding her
working
arms.
at a small bookstore,
Now we play
paying
smart.
off student loans.
We don't throw this at
and
him all
convinced
at
that
once.
romance belonged
We let
in
him
novels
think he's
more than
winning.
real life.
We let him
But
dig
Bennett
deeper,
swept me
get
up in a
comfortable.
whirlwind of promises.
And when he's at his
late
most
night
arrogant,
drives, when
flowers
he's
left on
you're
my
cornered,
doorstep,
we
long
drop
conversations
this.
about
And we
dreams
don't just
and
drop
futures.
it in court.
He told me he
We make
wanted
sure
a
it
family,
lands in the hands of
stability,
people he
love
never
that lasted.
expected.
And I believed
His boss,
him.
his clients,
Back then,
his
every
so-called
smile
friends.
felt like
We
destiny.
burned the
Every
mask
kiss
and
a
leave him
contract.
standing in
My
the
friends
ashes.
called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. I never imagined that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe.
My name is Selene Whitford, and I am for the first time in months I felt something I used to believe life was something alive inside me, power. That love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. This was offense. For years, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. Bennett wasn't the type to crumble part-time at the library. If he sensed and the raised our two kids with a patience I didn't know I had. He'd lash out harder than ever. My ex-husband, Bennett, I glanced at the photos of my children on the wall. I owed him everything. My throat tightening. My time, my money, my body, my voice. Could I afford to the scraps of affection? Annalise seemed to sense my hesitation, convincing myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, he's already doing everything he can to destroy you. I was wrong. The only way out is through. The day he left, he didn't just take the kids. This is the blow he emptied out our savings account. That night, I less than $100 to my name. I lay awake in bed, I remember the moment at the ceiling. Annalise's words always leaves a scar where it cuts. Every creak of the house made me jump. My hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for groceries. I hated that he still had that power over me. The teller looked at me with pity. Even with evidence stacked against him, flickering over her screen before she whispered that my account had been cleaned out that morning. Of Rowan's small hand gripping mine, my chest collapsed in on itself as I tried to process it anymore. My hands shook when I called Bennett for the right to tap them had already been blocked. To raise them in a home not poisoned by manipulation. But the office told me he had picked them up early that day. The folder wasn't just paper. I stood outside in the hot sunlight, and I had to decide if I was brave enough to realizing my entire life. The decision came the next morning in a matter of hours. Over breakfast, my family was gone. Emery spilled milk across the table and burst into tears. And so was every ounce of trust one had in him. Instead, I pulled her into my lap, like a tomb, kissed her hair, and whispered. Their toys scattered across the living room looked like abandoned evidence of a crime scene. The words slipped out before I could stop them, but they felt right. I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest. I wouldn't wait for Bennett until my tears blurred the room into a watercolor of grief. And with the neighbors by my side, I could feel their judgment. I would make sure his empire of lies collapsed. They know the truth about a marriage until it collapses. I picked up the phone and dialed Annalise. My mother called me naive. We're not waiting, my sister said as soon as she answered. I warned you. If we're going to do this, we do it now. The truth was simple. Before he makes another move, I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. Steady voice. The days blurred into each other because I've already set the trap. A fog of shock and disbelief. All you have to do, Selene, I filed reports, called lawyers, and begged a chill ran down my spine. The law moved slowly, dread and like it always does when women are crying. For the first time in this endless bruises, I wasn't just surviving. He's their father. I was preparing to strike, as though that excused the theft of both children and savings. When the dust settled, my lawyer shook his head sympathetically, the woman standing muttering words about the courthouse lobby buzzed financial disputes, heels clacking against marble floors. But while the process crawled forward like a wounded animal, thump of my heart, I was left behind in the ashes, across the room, surrounded by his attorney and my own little entourage of colleagues. Nights were the worst because nights carried memories. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, hair slicked back like he was auditioning for the role of perfect father. The fights over money, my stomach twisted. The secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. The smell of part of Annalise's shirt that wasn't mine. Let him bask in all arrogance. The little warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in us. Lips curving now, into a sneer every that sound whispered, of the empty house echoing around me. But for the first time, I didn't drop my gaze. He had been planning this for months. I met his stare head-on, the account transfers, my silence daring him to keep underestimating the kids' routines. What he didn't know was that the floor beneath his feet was already crumbling. He hadn't just abandoned me. Closer. He had executed a plan to erase me. Today isn't about winning. Some twisted part of me still loved him. It's about planting the seed. Or at least loved the version of him I thought was real. Her eyes that was glittering. The cruelest truth of all. The judge will see just enough to start when I thought I couldn't fall any lower. The call comes later. I almost didn't answer. My palms were damp because the number was unfamiliar. This wasn't the grand finale. But something in me, it was the tightening of the news, or just morbid curiosity. The hearing began, Bennett's lawyer strutted forward, delivering a polished like a hammer about Bennett's devotion as a father, so different from the cold financial struggles, his sacrifices. He rasped. Each word made my blood boil. My name hurt him. Lies stacked on lies. For a moment, nodded along, playing my heart clashing between hatred and the dangerous pull of old love. Her calm voice spilled out in a rush like a blade. There was a trial of charges against him, sliding a single sheet across the bench. He was going to lose everything. Request the court review new financial discrepancies after taking my children, my savings, and my sanity testimony. Now he wanted me to show everything. I wanted to hang document. I wanted to transfer that didn't match. But instead, I stayed silent. The judge frowned, scanning the paper on the other end. Her pen tapping the desk. Was too sharp to Mr. ignore. Hale, can you 5 days ago he had left me with nothing, not even a second before now he launched into a rehearsed excuse, begging for the one thing the damage was done. That flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes could either save him or bury him. Annalise's victory. The weight of that truth she didn't need the whole arsenal until I could hardly breathe. Just one bullet to remind him that he wasn't untouchable. A new version of me stirred awake. I watched Bennett shift in his seat. One who wasn't afraid anymore. His jaw tight. One who had been burned too badly to ever be gentle again. He didn't know it yet. Pleas filled my ear. But that moment was the first across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children. After court, their innocent smiles froze in the elevators. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. Nice try. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker that his cologne turned my stomach. He thought I was still the same Selene who would sacrifice everything out of my comfort. Don't embarrass yourself by thinking otherwise. He thought wrong. I whispered into the phone, low and steady. But now they only fed the fire burning inside. Underestimating me. I tilted my chin. His silence on the other end told me he heard the truth in my voice. While it lasts. That silence was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. But as I ended his eyes narrowed, my heart thundered with the realization that this was only the beginning. But before he could respond, his downfall wouldn't come easy. At my side. He would fight and manipulate, twist the truth, and even try to use the kids as pawns. Paper cuts this wasn't just a battle for justice. We walked away. It was a war for survival. For the first time, I felt the power shift in the air. For the first time in a long time, I came over with her laptop. Felt dangerous. He's rattled. When I first met Bennett, fingers flying over the keyboard. He wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. Rattled men make mistakes. He was charming in a way that disarmed me instantly. She pulled up a string of emails she'd intercepted through a source. The kind of man who seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel seen. Bennett raged about today's hearing, working at a small bookstore, paying off student loans, even if it kills him, and convinced that romance belonged to paying off someone at his firm to make Bennett swept me up in a whirlwind of promises. My chest tightened, fear and fury battling flowers left on my doorstep. So he's not just conversations about dreams and futures, I muttered. He told me he wanted a family, stability, love that lasted. And the deeper he digs, the harder every smile felt like destiny. That's why we let him keep digging. My friends called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. By the time he realizes he's that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play the part Annalise instructed. I went about my routine, school drop-offs, grocery runs, neighborhood walks, like everything was normal. Bennett called less, maybe sensing that I wasn't reacting the way I used to. He hated when I didn't beg or argue. That silence unnerved him. It was my weapon now. Behind the scenes, Annalise worked like a surgeon, stitching together a case that wasn't just airtight. It was explosive. She reached out to former clients of his, people he'd burned with shady business deals. Some agreed to testify, their anger finally outweighing their fear. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. I never thought I used to believe life was supposed to have some balance. I wasn't on the defensive. That love and loyalty would always pay you back in kind. One evening, as I tucked Emery into bed, I played the role of the perfect wife and mother. Mommy, why does Daddy look so angry lately? Worked part-time at the library. My heart ached, and raised our two kids with a patience I didn't know I had. Because Daddy's used to getting his way, had a way of making me believe I owed him everything. Now Mommy's learning how to stand tall. My money, my body, my voice. Her sleepy eyes searched mine. I clung to the scraps of affection. He tossed my way like they were treasures. I swallowed hard, convincing myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, Rowan, he would finally see me. Do. I was wrong. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with. He didn't just take when the kids. She drifted off, I lingered. He emptied out our savings account and left me with less than $100 to my name. But she was my anchor. I remember the moment. The reason I couldn't back down, because even betrayal when the fear always leaves a scar where it cuts. Bennett could threaten me all he wanted. My hands sweaty as I planned to withdraw money for groceries. The ferocity of a mother's ritual. The trap teller looked at me with pity. Later, her eyes flickering over her private investigator detailed that my account had been documenting his late-night meetings. Every penny gone. His trips to banks he swore he never visited. In on itself as I tried to process people he shouldn't be seeing. My hands shook when I called told a story he couldn't spin away. But his number had already been blocked. Meanwhile, I checked the kids' began spreading the office told me he had picked them up. Clients were asking questions. I stood outside in the hot sunlight, feeling it thrived on my skin, and the cracks realizing my entire life had been stripped from me in a matter of hours. His voice my family was gone. Charm. My savings were clever, Selene, and so was every ounce of trust one had in him. You're going to regret this. The house felt like a tomb that night. My hand trembled holding the phone, scattered across the living room, looked like abandoned evidence of a crime scene. The only thing I regret is underestimating how far you'd scream. But don't worry, I sat on the floor with one of their stuffed bears clutched to my chest, for what you are, rocking back and forth until my tears blurred the room into a watercolor of grief. He was dangerous when the neighbors whispered, and I could feel their judgment in the air. But Annalise's voice echoed in my head. Marriage until rattled it collapses. Men make mistakes. My mother called me Bennett naive. Was rattled. My sister every said, threat, every slip, warned you. Every desperate none of their words brought him closer to collapse. The truth was simple. I clung to that thought. I had given my life to a man who didn't hesitate to destroy me. Because deep down I knew the days blurred into each other. This wasn't just a fight anymore. A fog of shock and disbelief. And in war, I filed reports, cracks in the enemy's armor were anyone who would listen. The final piece of the trap slowly clicked into place, like it always does when women are crying, but no one sent me a text. It's ready. He's their father. Tomorrow we set it off. As though that excused in the theft of both children and hammer against the windows. My lawyer shook his head sympathetically. Tomorrow, muttering words about custody hearings, thinking he still controlled the board. A process. Tomorrow. But he while the process crawled forward like a wounded animal, nothing more than a step closer left behind in the ashes, and as lightning split through the smoke of my own whispered to myself the promise that had carried me this far. Because nights carried memories. This time, Bennett. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past year. Clouds pressed low over the courthouse. The secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. But I couldn't tell if the storm was outside on his shirt my that wasn't mine. Annalise all the little warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe as if she were marching into a boardroom with every sound of the empty house echoing around me. She whispered before we entered. Clearly. Remember, he had been planning this to drown. My legs trembled, but her sudden interest in the kids' like armor. The long absences into the with weak excuses. Bennett was already there. He hadn't just like abandoned who'd eaten the canary. He had executed a plan to casually against the table. And yet, some twisted part of me still loved him. As if today was just another performance of his long-running show. That was the cruelest smug exterior. I could sense the tension day when I thought I couldn't fall any lower. The slight tap of his foot. I almost didn't answer. He just didn't know how deep the fissure ran. But something in me entered. It could have been fate or just morbid curiosity. The hum of whispers died as everyone pressed the green button. Then sat. His voice hit me like a hammer, sinking raw and desperate. Bennett's lawyer began with the sameness that had cut me off, painting Bennett as a devoted father, like speaking my name integrity. I need you. Of my vindictive for a moment, bitterness. I froze. The words, my heart clashing between hatred and the dangerous for maximum effect. Then his words the edge of my seat until my knuckles. There was a trial, charges against him. It was like watching a play where everyone knew their lines, was going to lose but the ending had already been rewritten. I almost laughed. Annalise after taking my children, my savings, and my sanity. Her face unreadable. Now he wanted me to save him. She wasn't rattled. I wanted to hang up. She wasn't even I wanted tense. To scream. She was waiting. But instead, I stayed that silent. That terrifying to his frantic breath was almost worse than any outburst. The irony was too sharp because when she finally moved 5 days ago, he had left me with nothing. Your honor, not even dignity. Annalise began when it was her turn. He was crawling back, her voice begging for the one thing only I could give. Before my testimony, I would like to submit additional evidence that speaks directly to Mr. Hale's credibility down on me until I could hardly breathe. Somewhere shuffled nervously, a new version of me stirred away. She simply slid a thick folder across the bench. One who had been burned too badly to ever be gentle again. Scanning the documents inside my ear, Bennett shifted. I walked across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children. Leaned over to peep. Their innocent smiles frozen in time. The first ripple my hands trembled, but not from fear this time. Bank statements. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. Devastating collection that revealed not just financial lies, who would sacrifice everything for his comfort, and trips with a woman who was not his wife. Broke. All while swearing under oath that he was struggling to provide. Low and steady. The judge's frown deepened. You're going to regret ever underestimating Bennett's lawyer sputtered, objecting silence on the other end, claiming irrelevant the truth in my fabrication. Voice. Anything that to silence stall. Was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed. She countered each objection. But as I ended the call, her tone respectful but thundered with the realization that this was like a hammer on stone. His downfall wouldn't come easy. These are not allegations. He would fight. They are documented facts, truth, and even corroborated by witnesses willing to testify. This wasn't just a battle for justice. The judge raised an eyebrow. It was a war for survival. Another page, and I was done being the one who lost. Did you disclose for the first time in a long time? I didn't feel broken. Bennett felt dangerous. Closed when I first met Bennett. Forced a weak laugh. He wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. A clerical error. He was charming in a way that the judge's eyes had already hardened. Broad-shouldered, clerical errors don't include wire transfers to offshore banks. To make make me feel
Clerical
seen.
errors don't
I was
photograph
24,
you dining
working at
with
a
a
small
mistress you
bookstore,
swore didn't
paying
exist.
off student loans. His
And
mask was
convinced that
slipping
romance
piece by
belonged in
piece,
novels more
and
than real
everyone
life.
in that room could
But
see
Bennett
it.
swept me
I
up
watched
in a
as the
whirlwind
color
of
drained
promises.
from his face.
Late night drives,
The easy charm
flowers
stripped
left on
away
my
like
doorstep,
paint in acid
long
rain.
conversations
This
about
was the
dreams
man
and
who once
futures.
held my life in
He
his
told me he
fists.
wanted a
Who had
family,
stolen my
stability,
children,
life
life that
savings,
lasted,
my dignity,
and I believed
walked away
him.
smiling.
Back then,
Now,
every smile
cornered
felt
under
like
the fluorescent
destiny.
lights
Every
of the
kiss a
courtroom.
contract.
My
He looked
friends called us
small,
perfect,
pathetic,
and I let myself believe them.
His lawyer stammered,
I never
trying
imagined
to
that the
spin,
same
but
man
the
who
words
once
fell
made me
flat.
laugh until I
The
cried
judge's
would one day
patience
make me
was
cry
thinning.
until I couldn't
She
breathe.
leaned forward, voice sharp.
Mr. Hale, this court does not take kindly to perjury. Your credibility is severely compromised. The words were everything I had prayed to hear. They weren't the final blow, not yet, but they were the first crack of thunder before the storm split the sky. And Bennett knew it. His eyes darted toward me, burning with hatred, with fear. It was the first time I saw him realize he might lose. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31 years old. Her presence,
I used to believe
commanding
life
the
was
room.
supposed to have some
Your
balance.
Honor, with the court's
That
permission,
love and loyalty
we would
would
also
always
like
pay
to
you back in
submit
kind.
testimony from
For
former
years,
business
I
associates
played the
who
role
can
of the
corroborate a
perfect wife
pattern
and
of
mother.
deceit consistent
I cooked,
with what we see
cleaned,
here.
worked part-time
Two
at the
men in
library,
suits stepped
and
forward,
raised our two kids
called
with
to
a
the
patience
stand
I
one
didn't
after
know I
the
had.
other.
They
My
spoke with
ex-husband
measured
Bennett
voices,
had a way of
recounting
making
how
me believe
Bennett
I
had
owed him
manipulated
everything.
contracts,
My time,
siphoned
my money, my body,
destroyed
my voice.
reputations.
I clung
Their
to the
words
scraps
painted
of
him
affection
not
he
as the
tossed my
devoted
way like
father
they were
he
treasures.
pretended to be,
Convincing
but as a
myself
predator
that if I
in a
endured
tie.
enough, if I
Each
gave enough,
testimony was
he
another
would
nail
finally
in his
see me.
coffin. I was
And
wrong.
though he shifted
The day
and
he
muttered
left,
under his breath,
he didn't just take the kids.
He couldn't stop it.
He emptied
the walls
out our
he had
savings
built with
account
lies
and
and
left me with
intimidation
less
were
than
$100 to my name.
brick by brick.
I remember
Right
the moment
there in
front of the
vividly,
people he thought
because
he could fool
betrayal
forever.
always leaves
By
a
the
scar
time the
where it cuts.
testimonies ended,
I walked into the bank.
air in the
My
courtroom
hands
was sweaty
electric.
as I planned to
Everyone
withdraw
could
money for
feel it.
groceries.
The tide
the
turning,
usual
the
weekly
empire
ritual.
crumbling.
The teller looked at
judge
me with
called for
pity.
a recess,
Her eyes
expression
flickering
over her
unreadable but
screen
stern,
before she whispered
and
that my
people
account
shuffled
had been
out,
cleaned out
murmuring.
that morning.
Bennett slumped
Every
in
penny
his chair,
gone.
sweat
My
beating
chest
at his
collapsed
temple.
in on itself
His
as I
hands
tried to
trembling
process
despite
it.
his effort
My
to appear
hands
calm.
shook when I called
I
Bennett.
didn't move,
But his
number
number
had
had
already been
drinking
blocked.
in the sight.
I checked the
My
kids'
breath
school,
steady
but the
for the
office
first
told
time
me
in
he had
months.
picked them up early
This
that
was the
day.
man who told
I
me
stood
I was
outside in the hot
powerless.
sunlight.
This was the man
feeling
who
it burn
laughed
against
when he
my
took
skin,
everything from me.
realizing my entire
And now
life
he
had
was
been stripped from
unraveling
me
in
in
a
front
matter
of an
of hours.
audience.
My family
Annalise
was
leaned
gone.
toward me.
My
Her
savings
voice
were
low.
gone.
And so
He's
was every
finished.
ounce of trust one
He
had in
just
him.
doesn't know
the
how
house
finished
felt like a
yet.
tomb that
And
night.
in that moment,
their
I
toys
believed
scattered
her.
across the
During
living room
recess,
looked like
Bennett
abandoned
tried to
evidence
corner
of a
me in the
crime
hallway
scene.
again.
The silence
His
was louder
composure
than
shredded.
any scream.
What the hell are
I
you
sat
doing?
on the floor
He
with one of
spat.
their stuffed
His
bears
voice
clutched to
frantic
my
hiss.
chest.
You
Rocking
think
back
this
and forth
changes
until my
anything?
tears blurred
Judges
the room
love
into
me.
a watercolor
I'll
of
get the
grief.
kids,
The
and
neighbors
you'll be
whispered.
nothing.
I could
But
feel
the
their judgment
desperation
in the
in
air.
his tone
People
betrayed him.
always think they know the truth
His
about a
eyes
marriage
darted
until
around,
it collapses.
paranoid.
My
Like a
mother
man
called me
realizing the
naive.
walls were closing
My
in.
sister said.
I stepped
I
closer,
warned
my
you.
voice low
None
but
of their
steady.
words mattered.
No, Bennett.
The truth was
You're
simple.
the one who'll be nothing.
I had given my life
because
to a
the
man
truth
who
doesn't
didn't
hesitate
hesitate to
to
destroy me.
It just needs
the
to be
days
seen.
blurred into each other
And now
after that.
everyone's seeing
a fog
it.
of shock and disbelief.
His jaw clenched.
I filed
rage
reports,
twisting his
called
features,
lawyers,
but
and
he
begged
couldn't find
anyone who
words.
would listen.
The law
he turned
moved
away,
slowly,
fists
like it
clenched,
always
and I
does
knew.
when women are crying.
He
but
wasn't
no one
in control
sees
anymore.
bruises.
He was spiraling.
He's their father.
When the session
they said,
resumed,
as though
the
that
judge
excused
addressed
the
us
theft
with a
of
cool,
both children and
deliberate tone.
savings.
My
This
lawyer
court
shook
will
his head
review the new
sympathetically,
evidence in full,
muttering words
Until
about
then,
custody hearings,
custody
financial
arrangements
disputes,
remain temporary.
a process.
Her eyes
but
flicked
while the
to
process
Bennett,
crawled
sharp
forward
as a
like a
blade.
wounded animal,
But let me be clear.
I was left behind
If
in
this
the
evidence
ashes,
holds, Mr.
trying
Hale,
to breathe through
your
the smoke of
credibility
my
will
own
be
ruined
irreparably
life.
damaged.
Nights were the
And the
worst
consequences
because
will
nights
be
carried
severe.
memories. The words
It
rang
was in
like
one
a
of
bell,
those dark,
echoing through the
sleepless
room,
nights that I found
leaving
myself
Bennett
staring
pale
at the
and
ceiling,
silent.
replaying
I sat
every
taller,
moment
my
of the
pulse
past
steadier.
year.
The
The
weight
fights
on my
over
chest
money,
finally
the
lifting
secret
just
phone
enough for me
calls
to
I
breathe.
pretended not to
This
notice.
wasn't the end,
The
not
smell
yet.
of perfume
but it
on
was
his
the
shirt
beginning
that
of the
wasn't
end.
mine.
For the
All
first
the little
time,
warning
the
signs
ground
I had
beneath
ignored
us
because I
wasn't
wanted to
tilted in
believe
his
in
favor.
us.
It was
Now,
leveling,
with every
and he was
sound
the
of the
one
empty
sliding.
house echoing around
As we
me,
left the courtroom,
I could see
rain
it poured
clearly.
outside,
He had been
pounding
planning
against
this
the
for
glass
months.
like applause.
The account
Annalise
transfers,
clasped
the
my
sudden
shoulder.
interest in the
We've
kids'
cracked him
routines,
wide open,
the long
she said,
absences
her smile
with weak
faint but
excuses.
fierce. Now, every
He hadn't
move
just
he makes
abandoned
will
me.
only expose him
He
further.
had executed a
I looked
plan
back
to
one
erase
last
me.
time, and yet
Watching
some
Bennett
twisted
linger by
part
the
of
doorway,
me still loved him.
his shoulders
or at
hunched,
least loved the
his
version
face
of him I
dark.
thought was real.
He had
That
walked
was the
into
cruelest
court
truth
expecting
of all.
another easy
On the
victory.
fifth day, when I
Another
thought I
chance
couldn't
to
fall
prove
any
himself
lower, the call
untouchable.
came.
Instead,
I almost didn't
he left
answer,
drowning in his
because
own
the
lies,
number was unfamiliar,
gasping for control
but
that was
something in
already
me,
slipping
it could have
through
been
his
fate,
fingers.
or just
And
morbid
as the storm
curiosity
raged outside,
made me press
I
the green
realized the
button.
truth.
His
His voice
only
hit
the
me like a
beginning of
hammer,
his fall.
raw and desperate.
Bennett never knew
So
how to
different
lose
from the
gracefully.
coldness that had cut me
4
off.
days after the
Selene,
courtroom storm,
he rasped,
he
like
bombarded
speaking
my phone
name
with
hurt him.
messages.
I need
Swinging
you.
wildly
For a
between
moment,
threats
I
and
froze.
pleas.
My
You'll
heart
regret
crashing
this.
between hatred
We can
and the
fix
dangerous
this if
pull
you just
of old
back
love.
down.
Then
Think
his
of the
words
kids.
spilled out in a rush.
Each message
There was a
reeked of
trial
desperation.
charges against him.
A man
and without
clinging
me
to the
testifying,
illusion of control.
he was going to lose
I
everything.
didn't reply.
I almost
Annalise
laughed.
had warned me.
After taking my children,
Silence
my
was more
savings,
powerful
and my
than
sanity.
any retaliation.
Now he wanted me
Every
to
time
save
I
him.
ignored him,
I wanted to hang
I
up.
imagined the walls
I wanted
of his
to carefully
carefully
constructed
but
kingdom
instead
closing
I stayed
tighter,
silent,
squeezing the
listening
air
to
from
his
his frantic
lungs.
breath on the other end.
He had built
The
a
irony
life on
was too
manipulation
sharp to
and
ignore.
intimidation.
5
But
days
now,
ago,
the
he had
silence
left
he
me with
couldn't
nothing,
fill was
not
destroying
even
him more than
dignity.
my words ever
Now
could.
he was crawling
and deep
back,
inside,
begging
for the
for
first
the
time
one
in
thing
years
only
I
I
felt
could
free.
give. My testimony.
His next move was
My words
predictable.
could either save him
He
or
tried
bury
to
him.
charm the public.
The weight of that
A
truth
week later,
pressed
a
down
local
on me
magazine
until I could
published an
hardly
article
breathe.
featuring him
Somewhere
as a
deep inside,
devoted father,
a new
unfairly
version of me
maligned
stirred
in
awake.
divorce proceedings.
One who wasn't afraid
The photos
anymore.
were staged.
One who had been
Bennett
burned
at a
too
park,
badly
pushing
to
the
ever
kids
be
on
gentle
swings,
again,
smiling like
as
a
his
saint.
pleas filled my
But I
ear.
knew those smiles.
I walked across the
They
living
were
room and
rehearsed,
stared at
hollow,
the framed
like the
picture of our
lines of a
children.
bad actor.
Their innocent
What he didn't
smiles
realize
frozen
was
in
that the
time.
timing of the
My
article
hands
made him
trembled,
look guilty,
but not from fear
not
this
sympathetic.
time.
For the first time in
documents were
years,
public
I felt a
record,
flicker of power.
and people were already whispering
He
about
thought
the
I was
offshore
still the same
accounts,
Selene
the
who would
mistrust,
sacrifice
the lies,
everything for his
the
comfort.
comments online
The woman
weren't
who would
kind.
bend until she broke.
Words like fraud,
He thought wrong.
cheater,
I whispered
and
into the
pathetic
phone,
peppered
low
the
and
threads.
steady. Bennett,
You're going
thought
to
he was
regret
winning
ever
back the narrative,
underestimating
me,
but he was only digging
his
himself
silence on the
deeper.
other end
Meanwhile,
told me he heard the truth
Annalise
in my
worked
voice.
quietly,
That
relentlessly.
silence was sweeter
Every
than
time
any
Bennett tried
revenge
to
I
spin,
had ever
she was
dreamed
2
of.
steps ahead.
But as I ended the
sliding
call,
another piece
my
of
heart
evidence into
thundered
the
with the
court's
realization
hands.
that this
She
was only
unearthed
the
hidden
beginning.
loans,
His
unpaid
downfall
taxes.
wouldn't come easy.
Even an old business
He would
partner
fight,
who had been
manipulate,
silenced with
twist
hush
the
money
truth,
years ago,
and even tried to
Each
use the kids as
revelation didn't
pawns.
just tarnish his
This wasn't
credibility.
just a battle for
It
justice.
dismantled the myth
It
of
was a
Bennett
war for
Hale
survival.
entirely. And I was done being
He
the one
wasn't
who
the golden
lost.
boy,
For
the
the first
admired
time in a long
businessman,
time,
or the
I didn't
perfect
feel
father.
broken. Felt dangerous.
He was a liar,
when
a
I
thief,
first met
and a
Bennett.
manipulator who had
He wasn't
finally
the
run
man
out
who
of
would
smoke
later
and
tear
mirrors.
my world apart.
Watching it unfold felt
He was
surreal.
charming in a way that
For so
disarmed
long,
me instantly.
I'd been the one shrinking,
Broad-shouldered,
doubting,
deep
afraid
laugh.
to breathe too
The kind of
loudly.
man who seemed to
Now,
know exactly
it was
what
Bennett
to say
who
to make me
flinched
feel
when his
seen.
phone buzzed.
I was 24,
Who avoided eye
working at a
contact in
small
the grocery
bookstore,
store,
paying off
the
student
roles had
loans,
reversed,
and convinced
justice,
that
though
romance
slow,
belonged
was
in
merciless
novels
more than real life.
One evening, I
But
sat in the
Bennett
living
swept me
room,
up in a
scrolling
whirlwind
through
of
my
promises,
phone,
when a
Late
message
night
popped up
drives,
from an
flowers
unknown
left
number.
on my doorstep.
It was a video,
long conversations
grainy,
about dreams
shaky,
and futures,
but unmistakable.
He told me he wanted
Bennett,
a family,
red-faced
stability,
and screaming
love
at a
that
bartender,
lasted,
and I
slamming his
believed
fist
him.
against the
Back
counter
then,
until
every
security
smile
dragged
felt
him
like
out.
destiny.
My breath
Every kiss
caught.
a contract.
It wasn't the
My
polished
friends
mask
called
he
us
wore in
perfect,
public,
and I let myself
it was the
believe
monster
them.
I had known
I never
behind
imagined
closed
that the
doors.
same man who once
Minutes
made
later,
me laugh
the video
until I
was
cried
viral,
would one day make
spreading
me
like
cry until I
wildfire
couldn't breathe.
across social media. News outlets picked it up, branding him as volatile and unstable. For years, he had convinced everyone that I was the unfit parent, the unstable one. Now the world was seeing the truth for itself. And for once, I didn't have to say a word. The kids felt the shift too. They were young but not blind. "Daddy's mad a lot," my daughter whispered one night, her tiny fingers gripping mine. I wanted to protect them from his unraveling, but in a strange way, his downfall was teaching them something I never could. That masks always crack, and truth always crawls out of the shadows. Annalise reminded me to stay steady, to let the process finish its course. "He's burying himself," she said, sipping coffee across my kitchen table. "All we have to do is let him keep digging." She was right. And though it wasn't easy to watch, I knew that every misstep he made was another stone added
added to the weight crushing him. My name is Selene Whitford, and I am 31
Bennett
years old.
arrived disheveled.
I used to believe life was
bloodshot,
supposed to have some
voice
balance.
hoarse from too many
That
late
love and
nights
loyalty
trying to
would
spin
always
control
pay you back
he
in
no
kind.
longer had.
For years, I
His
played the
lawyer
role
looked
of the
defeated
perfect
before
wife
the session
and mother.
even began.
I cooked, cleaned,
Shuffling
worked
paper
part-time
with
at the
no
library,
confidence.
and
Analysts
raised two
presented
kids
the
with a
viral
patience
video,
I didn't
the
know I
financial
had.
discrepancies.
My ex-husband,
the testimony
Bennett,
of his
had a
former
way of making me
associates,
believe
and
I owed
finally,
him everything.
the emotional toll
my time,
he had
my
inflicted
money,
on
my
my
body,
children.
my voice.
The judge's expression
to
was
the scraps
sharp,
of affection. He
unforgiving.
tossed my way
When
like they were
Bennett tried
treasures,
to object,
convincing myself
voice
that if I
cracked,
endured enough,
and the judge
if I gave
silenced
enough,
him with a single
he would
wave of
finally
her
see
hand.
me. I was
Mr.
wrong.
Hale,
This
the
court
day
does
he
not
left,
tolerate
he
deception.
didn't just take the kids.
You have repeatedly
He emptied out our
undermined your
savings
credibility
account and left me with less
Custody
than $100
decisions
to
will
my name.
reflect this
I
reality.
remember the moment vividly.
In that moment,
because betrayal
his facade
always
shattered
leaves a scar
completely.
where it cuts.
I saw it.
I walked into the
flicker
bank,
of panic,
my hands
the realization
sweaty as I
that he
planned
was
to
losing
withdraw
not
money
just
for
the battle,
groceries,
but the war.
The usual
Outside
weekly
the
ritual.
courthouse,
The teller
reporters
looked at me
swarmed.
with pity.
Cameras
Her
flashed,
eyes flickering
microphone
over her
shoved
screen
forward.
before she whispered that my
Questions
account
hurled
had been
like
cleaned out
stones.
that morning.
4 years,
Every penny
Bennett
gone.
had thrived in
My
the
chest
spotlight,
collapsed in on
basking in
itself as I
attention,
tried to process
molding it to his advantage.
My hands shook when
But
I
this
called
time
Bennett.
it was different.
But his number
Every
had already
question
been
was a
blocked.
dagger.
I checked the
Mr.
kids'
Hale,
school,
is it
but
true
the
you
office told me
siphoned
he had
money
picked them up
offshore?
early that day.
What do you say
I
about
stood
the video
outside
of
in
your
the hot
outburst?
sunlight, feeling
it
worried
burned
against
against
my
my
skin,
custody?
realizing my entire life
polished
had been
answers
stripped from me
faltered,
in a matter of hours,
crumbled into
my
stammering
family was
denials.
gone.
My
Watching from a
savings were
distance,
gone.
I
And
felt
so
something
was
I hadn't
every
allowed
ounce of
myself
trust
to
one
feel
had
in
in
years.
him.
The house
Triumph,
felt like a tomb
not
that
petty
night.
revenge,
Their
not
toys
shallow
scattered across the
satisfaction,
living room
but
looked
the
like
profound
abandoned
relief of
evidence
knowing
of
the
a crime
truth was
scene.
finally louder
The
than his
silence was
lies.
louder than
The
any
nights that
scream.
followed were
I sat
eerily
on the
quiet.
floor with one of their
No
stuffed
more
bears
threats,
clutched
no
to my
more
chest,
staged articles,
rocking back
no
and
more
forth
frantic
until my
calls.
tears blurred the room into a
He had
watercolor
gone
of
silent,
grief. The
retreating
neighbors
into
whispered,
whatever
I
dark
could feel
corner
their
he still
judgment in the
controlled.
air.
But
People
silence,
always
I
think they know the
realized,
truth
was
about
its
a
own
marriage
kind of
until it
surrender.
collapses.
For Bennett,
my mother
who had
called
built
me
his life
naive.
on noise and
My
spectacle,
sister said,
silence
I
was
warned
the
you.
final humiliation.
None of their words
He
mattered.
wasn't the center anymore.
The truth was simple.
He wasn't the one
I
pulling
had given
the
my
strings.
life to a man who didn't hesitate
He was just
to destroy
another
me.
man exposed,
The days blurred
stripped
into
of
each
the
other
power
after
he had
that.
wielded so
A fog
carelessly.
of shock and
And while the
disbelief.
legal process
I
still
filed
had steps
reports,
to complete,
called lawyers,
the
and begged
outcome was
anyone
clear.
who would listen.
His
The
downfall
moved
wasn't
slowly,
coming,
like it had
always
already
does
arrived.
when women are crying.
One
but no
evening,
one
I
sees
stood
bruises.
at the window, watching the
He's their
sunset
father,
bleed orange
they
and
said,
pink across
as
the
though
sky.
that excused
the
the
kids
theft of
played
both
quietly
children and
behind me.
savings.
Laughter
My lawyer
drifting
shook
through
his
the
head
house.
sympathetically.
It struck me then
muttering
how far
words
we had
about
come.
custody hearings,
from fear to
financial
freedom,
disputes,
from silence to
a
strength.
process.
Bennett's
But
name
while
would
the process
always be a
crawled
shadow
forward
in our
like a
story.
wounded animal,
But it no
I
longer
was
had
left
the power
behind
to
in the
define
ashes.
us. Trying
The
to
world
breathe
knew the
through the
truth,
smoke
the court
of my
knew the
own
truth,
ruined life.
and most importantly,
nights
I
were the
knew the
worst
truth.
because nights
I wasn't
carried
the broken
memories.
woman he tried
It was
to
in
make
one of
me.
those dark,
I was the
sleepless
storm
nights
that
that I found
survived.
myself staring
And as
at
the
the
sun
ceiling,
dipped below the
replaying
horizon,
every moment
I
of the
whispered a
past
promise
year.
into the fading
fights
light.
over money.
This isn't your
the
secret
secret phone
anymore,
calls
Bennett.
I pretended
It's
not to
mine.
notice.
The silence
smell of
ended
perfume
on
on
a
his
gray
shirt
Monday
that
morning.
wasn't mine.
I was
All
halfway
the
through
little
pouring
warning
cereal
signs I
for the
had
kids
ignored
when my
because
phone
I wanted to
buzzed
believe
with
in
an
us.
unfamiliar number.
Now, with every
Against my
sound
better
of the empty
judgment,
house
I
echoing
answered.
around me,
And his
I
voice,
could see it
shaky
clearly.
and stripped of its
He
arrogance,
had been planning
came
this
through.
for months.
Clara,
the
it's
account
me.
transfers.
My hand
The
froze
sudden
on the
interest
counter.
in the kids'
Bennett's
routines.
voice was
The long
unrecognizable,
absences
hollow,
with weak excuses.
like a man who hadn't slept in days.
He hadn't just abandoned
I need
me.
you to listen.
He had
Please.
executed a plan
Every
to erase
instinct
me.
screamed to hang
and
up.
yet,
But
some
something
twisted
inside
part of me still loved
the part
him.
that once
or
loved
at
him,
least
the
loved
part
the
that
version
always
of him I
wanted
thought was
closure,
real.
kept me
That
still.
was the cruelest
His
truth
words
of all.
tumbled out in
On the
gasps.
fifth day, when I thought I couldn't
He was
fall
being
any
investigated
lower, the
for
call
fraud.
came. The
I
walls were
almost
closing
didn't
in,
answer,
and his
because the
lawyer had
number
told
was
him the only
unfamiliar.
chance he had left
But
was
something
to
in
convince
me,
me to
it could have
testify
been
on his
fate
behalf,
or just morbid
my knees
curiosity,
went weak,
made me
after
press the
everything
green
he
button.
had taken.
Now
his
he
voice
wanted
hit
me
me
to
like a
save
hammer,
him.
raw and
I agreed
desperate.
to meet him,
so different
not
from
out
the
of
coldness
sympathy,
that had got me
but out of
off.
curiosity.
Selene,
The cafe where we sat was nearly empty.
hurt him.
The hum of the espresso machine
For a
filling the
moment,
silence
I froze.
he couldn't bear. My heart clashing
He
between
looked like a
hatred
ghost of
and the
himself.
dangerous pull
Hair
of old
unkempt,
love.
suit
Then his
wrinkled,
words
eyes
spilled out in a
bloodshot and
rush.
desperate.
There was a
Gone
trial
was the
charges
confident
against
smirk.
him, and without me
carefully
testifying,
polished
he
exterior.
was going to lose everything.
This was Bennett
I
unmasked,
almost laughed.
raw and
After
pitiful.
taking my children,
Clara,
my
you
savings,
know me better
and my
than
sanity,
anyone.
he he pleaded.
Now he wanted me to
his
save
hands
him.
trembling
I wanted
around
to
a
hang
chipped
up.
coffee cup.
I wanted to scream.
If you testify,
but
if you
instead,
tell them I'm
I
not the
stayed
monster
silent,
they say I am,
listening
maybe
to his frantic breath on
maybe
the
I'll
other
have
end.
a chance.
The irony
I
was
stared
too
at him,
sharp to
the man
ignore.
who once called me
5 days
unstable,
ago,
who
he had
stole
left
my
me with
savings,
nothing,
who
not
ripped
even
the dignity
dignity
from my arms.
Now he was crawling
now,
back
in the cruelest
begging for the
twist
one
of
thing
fate.
only I could give.
He was begging me
my
to
testimony.
rewrite his story.
My words
For a
could
long
either
moment,
save
I
him
said
or bury
nothing.
him. My
The
mind
weight of that
flickered through the
truth
years,
pressed down on
the
me
betrayal
until I
of
could
the
hardly
courtrooms,
breathe.
the sleepless
Somewhere
nights,
deep
the children's
inside,
tears.
a new version
And
of
yet,
me stirred
across
awake.
from me sat
One
a man
who wasn't
was
afraid
no longer
anymore.
a villain, but a
One
broken
who had
shell
been
of one.
burned too badly
Part of me
to ever
wanted
be
to
gentle
scream,
again,
to relish his
as his
downfall.
pleas filled my ear.
But another part,
I walked
the one that
across
had
the
grown
living room
stronger
and
through
stared
pain,
at the framed
realized
picture of
the
our
truth.
children.
Their
His
innocent
story was no
smiles
longer
frozen
mine to
in time.
carry.
My
Bennett,
hands trembled,
I finally
but
said,
not from
voice
fear
steady.
this time.
I don't owe
For the
you
first
anything.
time in years,
Not
I felt
my
a
words,
flicker of power.
not my silence.
He
Not
thought I
my
was still the
salvation.
same Selene who would sacrifice
His face
everything
collapsed.
for his comfort.
The last remnants
the woman
of
who
hope
would bend
drained
until
from
she
his
broke.
eyes. He thought wrong.
He reached
I
for my
whispered
hand
into the phone,
but I pulled
low
back,
and steady.
leaving only the
Bennett,
cold space
you're going to
between
regret
us.
ever
Walking out of that
underestimating me.
cafe felt like shedding
His
the last
silence
chain
on the
that
other
bound
end
me to
told
him.
me he heard the
For
truth
years,
in my voice.
he had dictated
That
the narrative.
silence was sweeter
painted
than
me as
any
the villain,
revenge I
tried
had
to
ever
control
dreamed
the
of.
ending.
But as I
the
ended
truth
the call,
his
my
story
heart
ended
thundered
with him
with
on
the
his
realization
knees,
that this was
and
only
mine
the
began with
beginning.
me walking
His
free.
downfall
Outside,
wouldn't come
the winter
easy.
air was sharp.
He would fight,
cleansing.
manipulate,
The kids
twist
were
the
waiting
truth,
at home,
and even
and
try
for
to
once,
use the kids
the
as
future
pawns.
didn't feel like
This
something
wasn't just a
stolen,
battle
but
for
something
justice.
wide open.
It was
something
a war
I
for
could finally
survival.
shape.
And I was
didn't
done being the
testify.
one who lost.
I didn't return
For the
his
first time in a
calls.
long time,
I didn't need
feel
revenge
broken.
anymore.
Felt
Watching
dangerous.
him unravel
when I
was
first met
punishment
Bennett
enough.
He wasn't
Weeks
the man
later,
who would
the
later
news
tear
broke.
my world apart.
Bennett Hale was convicted of
He was
fraud
charming
and
in a way that
sentenced to years
disarmed
in
me
prison.
instantly.
The same
Broad
magazines
shoulders,
that
deep
once
laugh.
praised him now
The kind of
plastered
man who
his
seemed to know
mugshot
exactly
across their
what to say
covers.
to make me feel
From
seen.
golden boy to
I was
fallen
24,
man, working
one
at a small
headline
bookstore,
read.
paying
I
off
clipped the
student
article,
loans, not out of
and
spite,
convinced
but as
that
a romance
reminder.
belonged in novels
Power
more
built
than
on
real
lies
life.
always
But
crumbles.
Bennett swept me up
That
in a
night,
whirlwind
I
of
tucked the
promises.
kids into bed,
Late
kissed
night
their
drives,
foreheads,
flowers
and
left on my doorstep.
"We're free now."
Long conversations
Their soft
about
breaths
dreams
filled
and
the room,
futures.
steady
He
and
told me
safe.
he wanted a family,
For the first time in
stability.
years,
Love
I
that
slept
lasted.
without nightmares.
And I believed him.
His shadow
Back
no
then,
longer
every
lingered
smile
over my
felt like
dreams.
destiny, every kiss a contract. My friends called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. I never imagined that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe. My
Looking
name
back,
is Selene
I realized
Whitford,
something
and I am
powerful.
31 years old.
Bennett's betrayal
I used
had
to
nearly
believe life
broken
was
me,
supposed to have
but
some
it also
balance.
forced me to
that
rebuild
love and
into
loyalty
someone
would always
stronger.
pay you back in
Someone
kind.
who could stand
For
tall in
years,
courtrooms,
I played the role
who could
of
face
the perfect
lies with
wife
truth,
and mother,
who could
I
carry
cooked,
2 children
cleaned,
through
worked
storms
part-time
without
at the
collapsing.
library.
I
and
didn't
raised
just
our 2
survive
kids
him,
with a
I
patience I didn't
transcended
know
him.
I had.
He would
My
always
ex
be a part of my
Bennett
story, but
had a
not
way
the
of making
ending.
me believe I
The
owed
ending
him
belonged
everything.
to me,
to us,
my
to
time,
the life
my
we were
money,
now
my
free to
body,
create.
my voice.
Months passed,
I clung to the
and with
scraps
each
of affection
day, the
he
weight
tossed my
lifted.
way like they were
I
treasures.
found myself smiling
Convincing
again,
myself
laughing
that if I
again,
endured enough,
even
if I
daring
gave
to
enough,
imagine love again,
he would finally
not
see
the
me.
kind built
I
on
was wrong.
manipulation or
The day he
appearances.
left,
But
he
the
didn't
quiet,
just take the
steady
kids.
kind that grows
He
from
emptied out
respect
our
and
savings
truth.
account
and
and
left
those
me with
scars
less than
remained.
$100
They no
to my
longer
name.
ached.
I
They
remember
reminded
the
me
moment
of battles
vividly,
fought and won.
because betrayal
I wasn't
always
just a
leaves
survivor
scar
of
where it
Bennett
cuts.
Hale.
I walked
was
into
Clara,
the bank, a woman
my
who
hands
refused to
sweaty
be
as I
erased.
planned to withdraw
A mother
money
who
for
refused
groceries.
to give up.
The usual
A voice
weekly
that
ritual.
refused to be silenced.
The teller looked at me
and now,
with pity.
if you've listened to my
Her
story,
eyes flickering
if you've
over
walked
her
with
screen
me
through
through
the
before she
betrayal,
whispered
the
that
fight,
my
the
account had been
downfall,
cleaned out
and the
that
twist
morning.
that left even me
Every
breathless,
penny
I
gone.
ask you for something.
My chest collapsed
Stories
in
like
on
mine
itself
matter
as I
because
tried
they
to
remind
process
us
it.
that even in the
My
darkest
hands shook
betrayals,
when I called Bennett.
there is light to be
But
found.
his number had
Strength
already
to be
been
unlocked.
uncovered. I
And
checked the
freedom
kids'
waiting
school,
on the
but
other
the
side.
office told me he had
If this
picked them up
story
early
moved you,
that
if it
day.
made you gasp
I
or stood
cry or
outside
feel
in
less
the hot
alone,
sunlight,
please.
feeling
Like
this
this
video
burn against my
share it
skin,
with someone who needs
realizing
to hear
my
it,
entire
and subscribe
life
to
had
the
been
channel
stripped
for
from
more
me in a
stories that
matter
will
of
grip your
hours.
heart and not let
My
go.
family was
Because
gone.
in the end,
My
stories
savings
aren't
were
just
gone.
entertainment,
And so
they're
was
survival
every
guides,
ounce of trust
roadmaps,
one had in
reminders
him.
that none
the
of
house
us are
felt
truly
like
alone.
a tomb that night.
And maybe,
Their
just maybe,
toys
my
scattered
story
across
can
the
help
living
someone
room
else
looked
find the
like
courage to
abandoned
walk out of their
evidence
own
of a crime
cafe,
scene.
to leave their
The
own
silence
bed
was
behind,
louder than
and
any
to finally
scream.
claim their freedom.
I sat on the
This
floor
isn't
with one of
just
their
my
stuffed
ending.
bears clutched
It's
to
a
my
beginning.
chest,
For me,
rocking
for
back
my
and
children,
forth until my
and
tears
for anyone
blurred the room
listening
into
who
a
refuses
watercolor
to
of
let
grief.
betrayal define
The
their
neighbors
future.
whispered, I could
So as
feel
you
their
click
judgment
away,
in the air.
remember this.
People always
The power
think they
doesn't
know the
belong
truth
to the
about a
ones who
marriage
break
until
us.
it collapses.
It belongs to
My
those
mother
who
called
rise
me
from the
naive,
ashes,
who
my
refused
sister
to testify
said,
for the
"I
ones who
warned
stole
you.
their peace.
None of their
who
words
write their own
mattered.
endings.
The truth
and
was
my
simple.
ending.
It's
I had
brighter
given
than
my
I
life
ever
to a man who
imagined.
didn't hesitate to destroy me.
The days blurred into each other after that, a fog of shock and disbelief. I filed reports, called lawyers, and begged anyone who would listen. The law moved slowly, like it always does when women are crying but no one sees bruises. "He's their father," they said, as though that excused the theft of both children and savings. My lawyer shook his head sympathetically, muttering words about custody hearings, financial disputes. A process. But while the process crawled forward like a wounded animal, I was left behind in the ashes, trying to breathe through the smoke of my own ruined life. Nights were the worst because nights carried memories. It was in one of those dark, sleepless nights that I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past year. The fights over money. The secret phone calls I pretended not to notice. The smell of perfume on his shirt that wasn't mine. All the little warning signs I had ignored because I wanted to believe in us. Now, with every sound of the empty house echoing around me, I could see it clearly. He had been planning this for months. The account transfers. The sudden interest in the kids' routines. The long absences with weak excuses. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had executed a plan to erase me. And yet, some twisted part of me still loved him, or at least loved the version of him I thought was real. That was the cruelest truth of all. On the 5th day, when I thought I couldn't fall any lower, the call came. I almost didn't answer, because the number was unfamiliar. But something in me, it could have been fate or just morbid curiosity, made me press the green button. His voice hit me like a hammer, raw and desperate, so different from the coldness that had cut me off. "Selene," he rasped, like speaking my name hurt him. "I need you." For a moment I froze, my heart clashing between hatred and the dangerous pull of old love. Then his words spilled out in a rush. There was a trial, charges against him, and without me testifying, he was going to lose everything. I almost laughed. After taking my children, my savings, and my sanity, now he wanted me to save him. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream. But instead, I stayed silent, listening to his frantic breath on the other end. The irony was too sharp to ignore. 5 days ago, he had left me with nothing, not even dignity. Now he was crawling back, begging for the one thing only I could give. My testimony. My words could either save him or bury him. The weight of that truth pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Somewhere deep inside, a new version of me stirred awake, one who wasn't afraid anymore. One who had been burned too badly to ever be gentle again. As his pleas filled my ear, I walked across the living room and stared at the framed picture of our children, their innocent smiles frozen in time. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power. He thought I was still the same Selene who would sacrifice everything for his comfort, the woman who would bend until she broke. He thought wrong. I whispered into the phone, low and steady. "Bennett, you're going to regret ever underestimating me." His silence on the other end told me he heard the truth in my voice. That silence was sweeter than any revenge I had ever dreamed of. But as I ended the call, my heart thundered with the realization that this was only the beginning. His downfall wouldn't come easy. He would fight, manipulate, twist the truth, and even try to use the kids as pawns. This wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a war for survival. And I was done being the one who lost. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. It felt dangerous. When I first met Bennett, he wasn't the man who would later tear my world apart. He was charming in a way that disarmed me instantly. Broad-shouldered, deep laugh, the kind of man who seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel seen. I was 24, working at a small bookstore, paying off student loans, and convinced that romance belonged in novels more than real life. But Bennett swept me up in a whirlwind of promises. Late-night drives, flowers left on my doorstep, long conversations about dreams and futures. He told me he wanted a family, stability, love that lasted. And I believed him. Back then, every smile felt like destiny, every kiss a contract. My friends called us perfect, and I let myself believe them. I never imagined that the same man who once made me laugh until I cried would one day make me cry until I couldn't breathe.